Hola, les habla René Salgado, presidente de la iniciativa Empresomos Centroamérica. Nos pueden encontrar en empresomos.org. Bienvenidos a este intercambio de ideas sobre universidades, instrumentos financieros y desarrollo emprendedor, que es parte de nuestro programa Empresomos Conectividad Emprendedora Centroamérica, que estamos implementando en conjunto con CLATS de INCAE y CAMTIC. Hoy contamos con la participación de Luke Pittaway, Gloriana Jiménez Alice, Álvaro Figueredo y Francisco Zepeda. Luke es profesor de emprendedurismo y decano asociado de la Escuela de Negocios de la Universidad de Ohio, con varias publicaciones en prestigiosas revistas arbitradas en temas relacionados con capital de riesgo, emprendedurismo en la educación superior y universidades y ecosistemas emprendedores. La señora Gloriana Jiménez Alice es ejecutiva de instituciones financieras y programas estratégicos del BCE en San José, Costa Rica, que entre otras cosas se enfoca en el tema del financiamiento de pequeñas y medianas empresas. El doctor Figueredo es el director del programa de transferencia de tecnología de la Universidad del Valle en Guatemala, con experiencia de investigación y consultoría internacional en estos temas. Y el ingeniero Zepeda es decano de la Facultad de Informática y Ciencias Aplicadas de la Universidad Tecnológica de El Salvador y uno de los fundadores de la iniciativa de incubación prestigiosa Genius de la universidad. Algunos de los tópicos de esta interesante conversación incluyen cuál es el papel de la incubación de empresas en el proceso de facilitar acceso a recursos financieros para los emprendimientos jóvenes, cómo facilitar la transición de emprendedurismo por necesidad al de oportunidad, cómo ampliar el acceso a recursos para las spin-off o startups apoyadas por incubadoras universitarias, cuáles son las alternativas disponibles para el crecimiento empresarial en sociedades que carecen de los sistemas de apoyo de las economías modernas, como las bolsas de valores. Aunque el video de la conversación en inglés contiene subtítulos en el mismo idioma, estos pueden ser configurados para ser leídos en español presionando el botón subtítulos y haciendo la correspondiente selección. Esperamos que este diálogo sea de provecho para toda nuestra audiencia. And we welcome everyone to this conversation. And Luke Pittaway has the floor.
Thank you very much. Well, it's really very good to meet everybody today, and I'm looking forward to the conversation a great deal. You know, what we're talking about here today is how universities can contribute to the development of entrepreneurial ecosystems in particular regions and areas, and why a university might be important in an entrepreneurial ecosystem. So I've got 5 quick points to highlight, which I will do quickly, and then dig down into each of those areas a little bit more before opening up to the panel and engaging with a question and answer session with the panel. So the first area that universities are clearly important in is human capital development. So that's the first one. The second is research and development. The third is physical infrastructure. The fourth is neutral brokerage. And then the fifth is in venture funding itself. And so the first, I think, human capital development in some ways seems sort of obvious. You know, obviously universities are training lots of young people. They're training them to very high levels of educational attainment. And those individuals are gaining significant technical skills, which will help them be employees in local small businesses. But beyond that, I think it's also clear that universities have a role to play in the creation of both student and academic entrepreneurs. So here we can see human capital, academics potentially spinning out businesses or being involved in intellectual property that can be the cause of new ventures. And students actually starting businesses and being supported by the university for its entrepreneurship ecosystem and support systems to actually start businesses as they graduate from college. And also within the human capital space, we have to keep in mind that there's also alumni who sometimes financially invest, who give back to the university, and often are successful entrepreneurs in their own right that can mentor and support students and academic entrepreneurs. So the next area I mentioned was research and development. Clearly, universities, depending on their research intensity, are engaged in all sorts of different research endeavors. And those endeavors can lead to new technologies. They can lead to innovative ideas. Obviously, universities are investing significant money in labs and high-tech facilities, which can be useful to technology-based startups. And they produce intellectual property. They license that intellectual property, and that can sometimes lead to university spin-offs or the licensing of technology by local community-based entrepreneurs. So the third area is physical infrastructure. A university supports the development of physical infrastructure in a particular region. So just by having a university, sometimes if you're in a rural or deprived area, the transportation infrastructure has to improve. The IT broadband access often is significantly better because the university is located there. And on top of that, there are often physical spaces supporting entrepreneurial endeavor in that particular area. So for example, most universities will have engaged in science parks, maybe built incubators and pre-incubators, perhaps have accelerator programs, and have built maker spaces, fab labs, and other facilities designed to support entrepreneurship. So the fourth area is neutral brokerage. So universities are effectively neutral brokers. They're not necessarily interested in gaining a return on investment from ventures. And so they become a place where everybody else who's involved in the entrepreneurial ecosystem can meet in an objective and open space, free of competitive pressures. And so they become an important network node for the community entrepreneurs, for alumni entrepreneurs, for investors, for students, and for academic entrepreneurs to be able to meet and build entrepreneurial teams and actually launch ventures. And then finally, venture funding. We find that it is increasingly difficult in locations to access venture finance. And this is becoming true for most universities. Universities have very early stage ventures. They have high-tech ventures that maybe a little earlier in the development, or perhaps haven't demonstrated exactly how they will enter markets. And so there's often a funding gap for student and academic entrepreneurs. And so what happens is universities, certainly in developed economies, are starting to fill those funding gaps by creating their own venture funding. This comes in the form of startup capital in terms of perhaps seed capital grants or seed loans. Sometimes for student entrepreneurs, it can be a microloan finance. Increasingly, my own university is involved in social impact investing, where we're investing in social enterprises and looking for impact and return on investment as it relates to social impact. Often university-based researchers can engage with small businesses through small business research and development grants that are designed to create a relationship between a small business and a professor or a research team. And then we also are starting to see the launch of alumni and community business angel networks by universities, as well as public venture capital and venture capital, which are rarer but becoming more common. Universities using their endowment funding to support follow-on Series A, Series B finance for growth ventures. So just in summary, universities can play a really fundamental role within an entrepreneurial ecosystem and support the development of a region through their efforts in entrepreneurship training, but also in their efforts to commercialize existing research and technologies that they have access to. So at that point, I will close my introduction statement and hand back to the floor.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Luke, for this useful introduction to the different areas in which universities can contribute to entrepreneurial growth. And it was very compact and encompassing at the same time. And I'm going to ask Gloriana Jiménez to formulate the first question for you. Go ahead.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. Okay, my first question is, what is the role of business incubation in facilitating financial access for young enterprise?
That's a great question. There are lots of, so I'm going to take it sort of twofold. One is thinking about incubators, so the facilities that actually support student entrepreneurs and young entrepreneurs or young businesses, but also incubation as a process, because sometimes incubation can occur without actually a physical incubator. And so, well, I think the first thing that seems evident to me is that incubators can become really good focal points for entrepreneurship. So if you're looking for somewhere to start and you want to find the resources and the networks and the potential access to capital, going to an incubator or an accelerator program is a good way to get started. It becomes a focal point, somewhere where people that are entrepreneurially minded can sort of congregate and do things. I think incubation as a process is really helpful, particularly with younger entrepreneurs, student entrepreneurs, people that are just starting for the first time, to really think through their business models and to figure out products and services, to maybe engage in some lean launch processes, to test out their markets and establish the initial legal entities for the venture itself. And so it becomes quite important in the process of that kind of early stage, pre-launch, launch phase of the venture. I think, often, if we're talking about incubators, they are providing spaces for that are very cheap, usually for people to start in, that will allow some space where people who are starting will have the opportunity to meet other entrepreneurs and maybe network. And sometimes the venture that they're trying to create maybe doesn't get off the ground, but they have the opportunity to meet other people who are launching other ventures and then maybe join that team. And so it becomes a kind of a melting pot for activity and support and help. They also provide access to finance. I mean, people know that incubators are trying to start businesses and support students and people, entrepreneurs and community entrepreneurs and academics that are trying to start ventures. And so an incubator could be a focal point for the local investors to congregate and to meet people as well, so that they will also use it as the kind of door to access potential entrepreneurs. And I think one thing I should just sort of close on, I think, on this one, is that it is becoming evident that there is a kind of move a little bit away from incubators to accelerators. And I would just define that as an incubator being more of a place where it rents out physical space, it provides a little support, and then it lets people get on with their business of running their businesses and trying to launch them. So incubators tend to be a little more passive in their kind of support, whereas accelerators tend to be led by the investors themselves. Like VCs will run accelerators, and the accelerators tend to be much more active in trying to actually support the investment process, the launch process, the business model, the team generation, and also do more to open doors to potential investors and other things. So I think you find that a more common methodology is to see the launch of accelerator programs, and those are different from incubators. So many universities may have both an incubator and an accelerator program.
Great. Thank you so very much, Luke. What about you, Alvaro? Do you have a question for?
Thank you, Rene. Yeah. Well, look, I enjoyed a lot reading your paper on universities becoming the center of these ecosystems, and because that really shifts the perspective from technology transfer as a unilateral, unidirectional process to something that very much, I would say, a wide variety of entities, more than the triple helix, contribute to creating innovation and wealth. You would enjoy coming to Central America. You gotta come here.
Yes, well, I have never been, so I have actually I've been to Yucatan, but that's it.
We'll bring you here. We'll bring you here and give you a tour from Guatemala all the way down to El Salvador and Costa Rica. Anyway, to cut the long story short, we have a phenomenon here. It's interesting. We have a lot of universities that are very vibrant in terms of fostering entrepreneurship. I read how much it contributes having courses on entrepreneurship, and what we have had here is a plethora of courses, contests, and no capital.
Yep.
No accompanying the entrepreneur in those early stages. So we create a lot of hype, a lot of excitement, and when it comes to putting the money, the skin in the game, we fall short.
Yeah.
What has been your experience in those places? Because we have dense population here in our cities, unlike some of the context that you were describing, and sorry that I'm just making a whole story out of this, but I need to give you some context that you can answer. We have these big populations here, cities that vary from 2 million to 6 million people, you know, and we have a lot of dorm cities, as we call them, surrounding neighborhoods that basically people commute in and out from to work. And in spite of that, having lots of courses, lots of activities, the ratio of spin-offs and startups that we have that survive is very, very low. And we've done some research with some colleagues in this, and there are two main factors that we have identified that you pretty much expanded on in your paper. And one of them is capital, but early stages capital, okay? And that's really important. In your experience, what has been the main driver to shift this mentality of some family offices, VCs, and basically people who have the wealth to invest in startups to shift from investing in real estate, for instance, or investing in more mature or safer investments to give their money to startups and risk a little bit more? Because it seems to me that we have a lot of resources, but we lack the mentality that take risks. What has been your experience?
Yeah, that's a hard, well, a complicated question, and I'll start off by saying, I've seen some universities that have had enormous success with their student entrepreneurship startup without any real access to finance, and so sometimes that can be driven by encouraging students to develop business models that are revenue generating. So it's not always you don't always need to have money to start a business, and so certainly. The first thing is like, well, what is the entrepreneurship that's being, proposed for the students? I think, secondly, you can have a culture where, there's an opportunity cost. And so if students, for example, have a culture where it tends to be more like, well, we really want to get a job, then there's a tendency that they're going to probably go in that direction, even if they could have started a business. And so how, part of the entrepreneurship education agenda really is about changing that culture. It's about, if you look at European countries, I would say most entrepreneurship education in European countries started by trying to really change the culture of entrepreneurship across the country to like, actually, this is a real thing, you should be interested in it. And if you're not going to do it yourself, you're going to do more to support society to be more entrepreneurial in a general way. And so I think there's an element of how do you use entrepreneurship education to change the overall culture and the overall approach to how we would engage in it. I think on the finance side, I would say the problem that you're describing is a problem that exists in most countries. US maybe is probably somewhat unique. But I will say, first of all, universities in general, the type of entrepreneurship that's being created by universities, student entrepreneurs and academic entrepreneurs, tend not to be that attractive to investors, even in the US. So there is a gap in the US, and that's why universities have stepped into that gap. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more in a bit. But the gap exists because students are usually very young. They don't have collateral. Maybe they don't have a lot of experience. They don't have a lot of skin in, they can't put a lot of skin in the game. And so even banks and business angels, investors, people like that, maybe aren't that interested in investing in them because they're not sure. There's going to be a likelihood of a higher failure rate, and so that they're more of a high risk option. And so, often even in the US context, student entrepreneurs aren't that investment ready as far as investors are concerned. And so it's how do you get them to a point where investors might be more attracted to the type of venture they're trying to create. And then academic entrepreneurship has a different problem. Academic entrepreneurship is typically high tech. You've got these really incredible research-based technologies, but the business model is not clear, or who the customer is going to be is not clear, or which market you should sell it to. You've got really good technology, but it could go into multiple different markets. And so from an investor's point of view, that tends to be too early stage, and so they're not that interested in investing in it. So I think this problem is a problem for every country. When you talk about university-based entrepreneurship, I think it is a common problem. What I would say in terms of the specifics of what a country can do. I mean, I think obviously it's changing attitudes. The UK, I compare the UK to the US. I'm from both countries, and the UK has highly successful entrepreneurs and wealthy people, but they don't invest in startups. The US has a much larger number of business angel networks. You know, if you're a successful entrepreneur, you're much more likely to put that money back into other startups. You're also much more likely to invest in the university as a philanthropic effort, you know, give back to your own institution. And so I think there is a different cultural attitude towards investors. And I think finding ways to change how wealthy people think about how they deploy their money is an important component for the tax system, for the way in which government engages with what are the benefits of doing that. So if you do that, are there tax advantages to invest in that maybe you wouldn't get if you were to put that money in the stock exchange or some other type of investment? So you've got to find ways to change the way in which people get rewarded for the deployment of their wealth, I think. And then the final one I would say is another one to look at. And I don't know anything about the way in which people pay to go to college in Central American countries, but in the US, student debt is a real issue. So, you know, we see a declining number of young people starting businesses in the US, and that is really driven by the fact that the student debt system well, first of all, we've shifted the cost of education to the individual, and the individual has to borrow money from the federal government. As soon as they graduate, 6 months after they graduate, they have to start paying the loans. So in the US, there is a problem in terms of how we pay for education, and it becomes a barrier. And so I don't know how that works. It's probably different between individual countries in Central America, but I think that how students pay to go to college can have quite a significant impact on whether or not they can actually choose to start a business after graduation versus going and getting a job. So certainly in the US, you know, I talk to all of our entrepreneurship students, most of them are going and getting a job, even though they did we've trained them to do entrepreneurship, because they literally have to go and earn a certain amount of money so they can start paying the student loans back. And so changing how those student debt systems work becomes, and how we pay for college becomes an important consideration.
Okay, thank you, Luke. There was an interesting question and an interesting answer as well. Okay, next is Francisco. Do you want to pose your question? Go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Pittaway. And my question is related to the issue of gender. Women have an important role in the society. In El Salvador is very important. Is there any explanation for the facts that women tend to be subsistence rather than opportunity entrepreneurs in our region?
Thank you. This is a great question, and I should also put one before I answer this question. I should say I'm not an expert on female entrepreneurship, so I will answer it, but I will caveat that with this is an area that maybe I would not claim expertise to. But I think the first thing to say is that I think female engagement and entrepreneurship, but there's something called the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor, and it looks at entrepreneurship across countries worldwide, and it looks at the male to female ratio for entrepreneurship in different countries, and it varies considerably between different countries. To some Scandinavian countries where, you know, it's almost more female entrepreneurs starting businesses to male entrepreneurs. You know, there's some very high necessity-based female entrepreneurship in African society, in some West African societies where actually it's not considered appropriate for men to really start businesses, so it tends to be more female orientated. And then there are other cultures where typically more men are going to be starting businesses and engaged in entrepreneurship, and it's less of a female activity. So I think the first answer obviously is clearly individual cultures of countries, and there is a measure of masculinity that is in part of the way in which we measure culture. And so how we think about male and female roles in a culture really does influence the impact of female entrepreneurship within that particular country. So that's a challenge. So if you have a culture that is very, orientated towards more men going into the high growth businesses and the high tech businesses, and more females going into the subsistence or professional services, or the retail businesses or the smaller businesses that tend to be just to generate an income for the family, how do you change that picture is a big question that many countries kind of have to deal with. And so there are lots of ways to think about that. The first one is to start to develop growth-orientated programs for specifically for female entrepreneurs that are in that subsistence space. So there are a number of programs in European countries that are designed to support people who are really they've got a small business, but it's not really growing or developing. And so the program is designed to go in and support, a portfolio of people in that position that actually could, in fact, grow, and to really train their leadership skills and entrepreneurial skills to unlock growth in existing small businesses. And so the Goldman Sachs program does that in the US and the UK. And there are a number of programs back in Europe that were designed specifically to go, okay, here's some small businesses that are doing well. Perhaps we can find ways that people are already being entrepreneurial, but it's subsistence orientated. Let's try to turn that subsistence orientated entrepreneurship into something that's more growth orientated. And so because they're already being entrepreneurial, they're just not aiming higher in terms of their aspirations and their desire and their skill set to actually manage those growth activities. So that's one thing. I think obviously, we see it in entrepreneurship programs, even in the US. There's more male students in our entrepreneurship programs than there are female students, which is problematic because we have more female students at our university. So the challenge then is how do we consider and develop the educational programs at high school, elementary level, and also at our university level that would support more and encourage more female entrepreneurship. I mean, certainly there are some interesting things here. I don't know if you may have seen a post that I put on that, in the US, the Girl Scouts sell cookies. And so there's enormous amounts of female entrepreneurship involved in the Girl Scouts in the US and trying to support young girls to learn how to sell and how to develop a small business in that program. And so we're talking about kids that are, 12 to 16 age, and so they're quite young, and so they're getting a little bit of a taste of entrepreneurship very early on. And so there may be programs like that can start at much earlier levels that could support some changes to female role models. And I think the other thing is when we talk about things like this, we see significant changes when we see the media starting to play a role. So bringing in, programs on television that are really highlighting specific high growth female entrepreneurs, for example, and following them. And, the impact of things like Dragon's Den, Shark Tank, we have The Apprentice, a whole host of programs that came out in the UK and the US, really shifted the mindset about and views about entrepreneurship. And so I think there are also some roles to play to encourage TV programs that maybe change the attitude or aspirations of society in relation to the role of female entrepreneurs. I mean, certainly the evidence suggests, though, that unlocking the female part of entrepreneurship for a society becomes important if you want economic development. And so trying to find more female entrepreneurs that will shift from subsistence to high growth is going to be supportive of trying to provide those role models for other female entrepreneurs, but also enable them to employ other female employees and then have that influence the spill out or the spin-overs that would come from that in terms of other people then starting businesses. So I think there's a lot to unpack there. It's not an easy thing to solve, but certainly trying to change the culture of society, the way we train people is really part of what needs to happen. Okay, hopefully I answered that. Okay.
Thank you very much, Luke. I just want to mention something briefly. We have 12,000 followers in Facebook, 60% of whom are young girls. So there is a willingness in our female population to become moving from subsistence to opportunity entrepreneurship, and really to be part of the entrepreneurial growth in the region.
Yeah, and I think that's fantastic. I mean, honestly, I think that's where you start. You've obviously got people who have aspirations to it. So the key is how do you unlock those aspirations to shift from subsistence to opportunity-based entrepreneurship?
Absolutely. Gloriana, you have another question for Luke?
Yes, of course. Okay. Well, here at the region, we have many gaps, many barriers, talking about uh, financial access to these new entrepreneurs. So, my question is, what are the alternatives to help new ventures meet the guarantee and collateral requirements to obtain financing? Because this is, I think that is the most or the main barrier that the entrepreneurs are having trying to access to financing in Central America. So that is my question. What do you think about it?
Yeah, and I think we touched on this somewhat earlier as well. I think the first and obvious issue is that it isn't it is a common issue. I mean, if I look at my students, they don't have collateral typically, and they've just been at college and they've got a lot of occasionally you'll see a student that's started the business on campus and been successful as a way to pay off their not to have student loans, but that's kind of a rare example. Usually they're coming through the system with maybe a little bit of family finance, but not much else. And so I think most young people kind of face the same problem where they don't have guarantee, they can't have personal guarantees on loans, and they can't have collateral. So there's a lots of kind of answers to this question. I mean, the first one obviously is what I said earlier, which is like encourage business models which are revenue generating without necessarily needing a lot of investment. And that is possible. That is particularly today as some of the technologies advanced in such a way that there are many things that you can put into a business that aren't necessarily that expensive. So certainly starting there. So when I talk to my students, I'm often talking about, well, what about thinking about other ways to start a business than doing than actually a new venture. So in the US, we have a baby boomer issue where we have lots of people who are now getting to retirement age and needing to really get out of their businesses. Many of those families don't necessarily want to take on the businesses, and so there's this glut of businesses that are up for sale. Young people can go and buy a going concern. The bank may not, if they build a team, a bank may not be that interested in that if it's just a student entrepreneur. But if they've got a team of people, they can go and buy a going concern, and the bank is much more likely to loan them the money if it's a going concern with assets and everything comes with it. Same with franchising. We talk a lot with our students about franchising. It's like, well, franchising are established businesses. You can go buy and franchise. A bank is much more likely to loan you the money if you buy a franchise. So I think sometimes when we do entrepreneurship, we've got to get a little bit beyond the new venture startup mindset and a little bit more into how do you start a business? Like inheriting a family business, for example, is another good way that people start business. So other examples are going and working for a company and then ending up spinning out a venture from the company. And so there are other routes into venture creation or to being an entrepreneur. And I think sometimes we have to kind of make sure that our young people are more aware of the range of different avenues they can take. As to guarantees and collateral, I mean, there are systems, and I don't know what these are like in the countries of Central America, but there are countries in the UK, US, and Europe that have government loan guarantee schemes. So I can go to the Small Business Development Centre here, or I can go to what was Business Link in the UK, and I can get a loan, and the government will guarantee the loan. So it's still from a bank, but the government is providing the guarantee for certain types of startups. So that is an option that is used. And then microcredit in a lot of countries plays a very important role here. It's like you can have microcredit organizations. Some of those microcredit organizations still require collateral, but a real microcredit organization doesn't typically require collateral. So the idea of microcredit is designed to get beyond that issue of not having availability of finance, where you require collateral. And so some microcredit companies that come into certain communities and areas can be very valuable in terms of filling the gap in terms of access to money. The other thing we talk about a lot of our students is buy, barter, borrow. It's like you don't have to You don't have to buy everything. Sometimes you can borrow it from somebody, or you can barter with somebody. And so having ways of starting that are very low cost, but still allow you to acquire the assets that you need to in order to launch the business is another thing that we do tend to talk about a lot with our students. Is like, you can't raise the money, so let's see what other methods you can do. And then finally, obviously, I think you probably know that most finance anywhere in the world comes from friends and family. And so this is one of the problems in entrepreneurship, is that if your family is wealthy, or you have friends that are a little bit better off, then it's easier to start a venture than maybe if you're coming from a poorer background. And so friends and family are often a key resource, but obviously that has some limitations if you're trying to be more equal in the way that you help young people start businesses. I think, I think that's the main answer to that one. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Luke. Alvaro, it's your turn. You have another question?
Yeah, I have a rather unconventional question for you, Luke. We need to adapt all these financing systems. You know, it's not just the lack of capital, but the way we invest capital. I think that now the gold standard is basically anything that has to do with shareholders, IPOs, exits. What about people wanting to keep their money for life invested in a company and not have an exit? I always question that, you know, because it seems to me that in the moment we had investment bankers, and my apologies to investment bankers, but I disagree. I mean, there is not just one way of investing in startups and spin-offs. What's wrong, especially in these countries? You know, if you have a business, when you have broken that barrier, the cultural barrier, you know, because in Central America, we have many regions where having a business is bad. You know, it looks bad on you, for many other reasons that we won't discuss here. But don't you think that it would be nice to also have this option where a wealthy man wants to invest in a business that promises and keep it for life, and they might be interested in selling it later on, but not necessarily? I don't know if you've seen this anywhere else.
No, that is actually surprising. I mean, again, it depends on the nature of the individual who's starting business, what they want from the business, and then also the people that are investing. So it's not unusual. I mean, there are two forms of investment that we see quite regularly here. The first one is obviously loan finance. And although, you know, obviously when we think about loans, you think about banks and banks providing loans. There are government loan guarantees, which I've just mentioned, where the government is providing the guarantee for the loan. But actually, you know, there are passive business angels who aren't really that interested in being involved in the business, who will more likely loan money to the business than they would actually invest in equity. And so it's not, you know, it's not uncommon actually to see people engage in that. And you have even like, what do they call them? Venture equity groups and other more serious, you know, vehicles that will engage in loan finance as opposed to actually venture finance. And so I think that really depends on the individual entrepreneur, what they're looking for, how fast they want to grow, the nature of the type of investment, the investors, what the investors want. So there's lots of possibilities there. I think the other one that is talked about here a lot, we talk with our students about, is convertible notes. And so a lot of entrepreneurs here will go, not entrepreneurs, our business angel networks and our seed capital venture capitalists will do what's called a convertible note, and that is more, you know, it's a loan, and so there's an expectation that the entrepreneur will pay back the loan with the interest that's obviously charged as part of the contract. But then there's a convertible element. So if the business performs at a certain level and it hits certain, you know, it's really starting to grow, then that loan can convert to equity at the point that another investor might invest in the business. And so that's designed to try to not to dissipate the value of the business or the equity in the business too early on. So the investor can get the upside if they want to when the business gets to a certain level. They've also controlling the downside. You know, if they still get the loan back if the business is doing okay but not really, you know, growing enough. And from the entrepreneur's point of view, it's easier to raise their next round of finance because they've not sold equity in the business. So convertible notes are kind of an interesting. I'm no expert on that. I'm not a finance expert, but I do know a little bit about that, and it is interesting to see that become quite a big thing. I think the other thing here is to not underestimate the role of things like grants. I mean, it can be a problem. People can end up chasing grants instead of trying to generate revenue. And I would always encourage somebody to build a business model that generates revenue and then look at everything else. But certainly, we're talking about academic entrepreneurship, the research and development grants. So there's a collaboration between a university and an academic and a small business. That gets used a lot by academics to start businesses. It's like, I want to start an academic entrepreneur. I'm going to start a small business. I'm going to get a research and development grant that allows me to work on the stuff I'm doing in the university from a bench point of view and bring it into my small business and get some money and some support to do that. So there can be, for certain types of businesses, grant opportunities. And again, it depends on the particular country that you're talking about and what systems they have in place for that type of thing. Yes, I think I'm good on that one. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. That's great. What about you, Ingeniero Zepeda? Do you have this is going to be your final question, right?
Okay, thank you. I believe from my experience in higher education that we are overcoming many barriers. That is, our youth is making a very important difference, but the predominant culture among university students in El Salvador is completing a degree to get a job. Is really are these feasible alternatives to facilitate the transition towards a student culture more oriented towards entrepreneurship and innovation rather than just employment?
Yeah, thank you. That's a wonderful question. We're seeing this across the world that I think there's something called university-wide entrepreneurship education now. In the old days when I started my career, entrepreneurship would be in the business school. Might be a center. There might be students taking a major in entrepreneurship, but they're business school students. And it really didn't touch anything else. And so now we're moving to a situation where we have colleges of entrepreneurship that are outside the College of Business. We have schools of entrepreneurship that are outside the College of Business. And what's happening is entrepreneurship is getting embedded in every subject across the campus, so that if you do mechanical engineering, you're going to get some entrepreneurship. If you're doing arts, sculpture, you're going to get a little bit of entrepreneurship. And so I think one of the things that is becoming evident is there's this desire to really expand entrepreneurship education to every student on campus, so that they're aware of the opportunities. But it doesn't totally solve the problem. I mean, some of the other issues we talked about, how do you, many people go to college because they want to get a job. And so how are they paying to be at college? Is their method of paying to be in college getting in their way of their ability to start a business, even if they wanted to? How could you, there are examples in the UK where we actually the UK has provided internship funding. So instead of getting an internship in a company for a year, they have an internship and the government gives them some money to do that internship to focus on starting their business in the university. So it's their internship, but instead of a corporate job, it's a full-on 1 year focused on launching the business. And so there are efforts to really find ways to make it more feasible. And then there is a debate. I mean, a lot of people will argue, and entrepreneurs that we have successful will say it's not the best time for somebody to start a business straight out of college. So there's a camp that will say, go and get experience in your industry and then start a business. So a lot of people will say, be an entrepreneur in a corporate job is fine, and then use the corporate job to launch your venture so that you've got experience in the industry before you launch something. And then there's another camp will say, well, actually, being naive as an entrepreneur is actually a good thing, because you rethink how certain industries work, and you might be more likely to be disruptive innovator and come to the industry with a completely different business model. So starting straight out of college is really, really important, because that way you will totally rethink how that particular industry, that particular business works, and come up with new business models, and much more likely to be disruptive. And so I think if you're looking at those types of entrepreneurs, then you've got to have, physical space, incubation support, accelerator support, fab labs, maker spaces, physical infrastructure, and support mechanisms that are specifically designed to help those students launch. But I will tell you, it's a smaller percentage. I mean, we might have, let's say we've got 200 students that are actively doing entrepreneurship very specific entrepreneurship programs. That's like a certificate or a major in entrepreneurship. And then lots of students in, a class here and there all over campus. Of that 200 students, maybe 7 or 8% are actually trying to start a business straight out of college. So even in a US or UK context, there's not that many students that are actually trying to launch something straight out of college. Usually they're looking to go work and then do something. And like I said before, sometimes a new venture isn't always the right approach either. Maybe buying something, or many of my students work in family businesses. So we're having quite a lot of conversations about, what about succession planning in your family business? Is this something you want to take on? Should you be, are you likely to end up being an entrepreneur in an unintended way because you inherited a family business and it's not even really the thing that you're that interested in working on? And so that's a big topic for us, because we're in a rural area, and so a lot of our students are actually in family businesses. So I think again, it also one has to focus a little bit on the nature of the entrepreneurship, and therefore consider the nature of the support as it relates to the nature of entrepreneurship the student might engage in. But it's certainly a common problem.
Well, this is really great. I don't know if you have any other questions for Luke, who wants to go next. If there are any remaining issues that you would like to address.
Okay, Luke, I don't know if you've come across this model. A lot of entrepreneurs, when they are given cash, they burn it. We've seen ridiculous stuff done here in Central America. The guy that rents the penthouse and throws a big party the day he gets that, or he goes and gives a down payment for the Porsche 911, crazy stuff like that. Right, so there's a normative economist in Argentina. He's Uruguayan actually, and he designed a system whereby you give them vouchers, and those vouchers are backed by a funds fund, which provides funding to the whole ecosystem. It's really interesting. It's just like having a blank check where you can go anywhere. I can go and I can do a prototype in a university, and then I can go with you as my consultant on strategy, and I can go with someone else for finance. I don't know if you've seen any like this anywhere else.
Yeah, no, I can't say I've seen that model elsewhere. What I do know is part of the shift. Well, so the issue of like getting a big chunk of money, burning it. I mean, sometimes inappropriately, sometimes appropriately, but still burning through it. It was a common problem in Silicon Valley as well. I mean, it's not an unusual problem to have that. And I think the way, I mean, obviously you have periods of time when there's a very large amounts of money in the system, and then you have times when there's less money in the system. And so we're about to enter a time, I think, when there's less money in the system. We've just gone through one when there's a lot of money in the system. And so that tends to happen more when there's a lot of money around. However, I think VCs in the US have learned, this is why accelerators exist. They are doing much more proactive engagement with entrepreneurs and hand-holding and building ventures instead of just investing in them. And then also, we're seeing much more staging of the finance today. It's like, okay, you've got $20,000. What are you going to do with $20,000? Let's see the results of that $20,000. Let's see your prototype. Let's see what you did. And then we'll give you, $100,000 to launch the business and acquire customers. And let's see how you do that. How do you perform with doing that? And then you maybe invest the next, $500,000. And so I think the way people have got around it in the the genuine sort of venture capital community in the US is to stage the investments and have clear milestones for people and be much more active in the way in which they engage with ventures. So I haven't seen that model. It's certainly an interesting model. I like that, and I can see how that could be really valuable. But I also think, again, I think there is a danger of having too much money. I actually think, I mean, some businesses to grow rapidly need, a lot of money put into them. But I've also seen plenty of people, particularly in European context, where there's a lot of grant funding, ended up being a grant funding chasing company instead of a company that's a business model that's generating revenue. And so I think sometimes it's better to focus on, okay, how does this business model actually generate real revenue and grow generating revenue, and less about, where access to finance and the finance that's coming. So, I mean, I'd say Amazon's the best example. Amazon grew because it sold lots of stuff and then it reinvested the revenue in its growth. It grew through revenue. And so there are definitely good examples you can pick on that's like, it is possible, even with the high growth companies that become multi-billion-dollar businesses, to grow that way.
Yeah, in my opinion, these guys, well, even not just grants, but also investors. Look at Tesla. I mean, they have lived just by grants and investment coming in, but I don't know. For me, it has to be like scaffolding. You have to remove it at some point and see if it survives without it.
Exactly.
Right? Just more organically, just by pure hard sales, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think the challenge one sees is that it's a bit like the corporate venture space. Things go through cycles, and when there's a lot of money in the system, the money is not free, but it's easier to come by. And so there are lots of businesses that end up just having more cash than they really need and then burning through it, and then not necessarily building a business model which is sustainable. And then suddenly the situation changes, the cash gets taken away, it's not as available, it's much more expensive, interest rates go up, and all of a sudden they're not viable businesses. And I think honestly, I think it's still we still don't know if Tesla really is a viable business because of what the way they've taken on investment and the amount of money it's been burnt for as they built it. So we'll only find that out once they get to that point where they've not got that influx of money. And you see it in corporate venturing. So corporate venturing is all about big companies engaging in entrepreneurship, and it goes through cycles too, where if the economy is really good and there's a lot of money, everybody's like, oh, we should be doing corporate venturing. We're gonna try and spin off new ventures and invest in those ventures. As soon as the economy goes bad and there's not as much money around, everybody shuts it down. The problem is that for corporates to generate new ventures, they also need 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 years for those businesses and the systems they put in place to be successful. And they're always putting all this effort into building things and then shutting it down too soon. And so there's this kind of constant kind of flux, and you see that in the entrepreneurship space as well. And I think anywhere where there's a company that's got lots of money and it's burning it really easily, also burning it on things that aren't relevant to the startup itself, that would be a kind of bad sign, I would say.
Yeah. And I just want to make one last comment, Rene. I'm really sorry. Just one last thing. You mentioned something really important. We have seen in many places that the valley of death is not 42 months long. I have a friend who runs the Idea Center in Notre Dame in Indiana. And he told me that startups there who are fully backed by all these strong schemes that you have in the US, it takes them 8 to 9 years to reach that tipping point where they can start flying solo. So I don't know what your experience has been, but in my opinion, 3.5 years is far from realistic.
No, it's never enough. I mean, 3 years is the kind of the benchmark of, like, usually a small business will start and it will get going, and it should be viable and should be viable after 3 years. But we're talking about like retail businesses and restaurants and that kind of business, and small businesses. When you talk about academic entrepreneurship and to some extent technology focused businesses, sometimes there's a lot more work that has to go on to validate the actual technology itself and the efficacy of the technology. And so that's why academic entrepreneurship is hard to get investment, because often there's 2 or 3 years worth of effort involved in actually validating the technology before you can even sell something. And so that's why VCs typically don't get involved in that, because it will take 8 years. And and if you're in a medical space, it's going to take a lot longer than that, because you've got to go through all the hoops for medical approval processes. And so I think some of the high tech, technologically sophisticated ventures take a lot longer And many governments have systems in place to support that kind of early stage high technology stuff, because that becomes the future of all sorts of different types of industries in some cases. And so, you know, it's important to have, first of all, the research going on, but it's also important to have a mechanism to get that research into commercialized ventures, and recognize that your typical private investors are not going to probably have that much patience. And I think also, you know, that's where we see you know, a lot of challenges, I think, for academic entrepreneurship and for universities in general, getting from that lab type entrepreneurship to the potential, you know, commercial spin-outs is actually really hard. And I think the concept of technology transfer, how we currently do it, where we basically have a tech transfer office, the academics go through a process, they get IPI, intellectual property protected, you know, patents, whatever, and then they license it to companies. That whole system is a complete and utter failure and needs to be revised. I mean, most universities have that technology transfer system. That doesn't work. I mean, as an entrepreneurship professor, I look at that, and there's plenty of research that justifies this. Tech transfer in that traditional model doesn't really work very well. And so you've got to, you know, it's another thing to think about is that, you know, that traditional approach to tech transfer needs to change.
5% of the patents are commercialized only.
Okay, I asked Luke for 45 minutes, and he has, you know, given us around 60. So I think it's time to close the conversation.
Sorry that I monopolized the question. Sorry to Francisco.
Oh no,
sorry.
It's been good. And thank you very much, everybody. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Absolutely. Let me say the last few words in Spanish. Okay, bueno, muchas gracias, Luke, muchas gracias, Álvaro, muchas gracias, Gloriana y Francisco, por este intercambio de ideas que muy estimulante, que es parte de nuestro programa Conectividad Emprendedora Centroamérica. También agradecemos la atención de nuestra audiencia y les recordamos que algunos de los temas que estaremos abordando en los próximos días con el apoyo de expertos incluyen, entre otros, emprendedurismo social, franquicias, habilidades y actitudes emprendedoras para el éxito en el mundo moderno, y también continuaremos con este tema de entidades educativas y ecosistemas emprendedores. Y si están interesados en estos intercambios de conocimiento, los invitamos a suscribirse a nuestro canal de YouTube y también a seguirnos en nuestras redes sociales. Muchas gracias a todos de nuevo y por esta estimulante conversación. Muchas gracias.